Persona, which started as a spin-off of the mainline SMT series, Shin Megami Tensei, has become its own massive franchise that in truth has overtaken the popularity of SMT as a whole. Persona 1, which was released around in the mid-90s, is starkly different from what the series has become today. Persona 5 is the epitome of the modern Persona series, and more so the wider JRPG genre as a whole. Persona 3 is when the shift really started to happen. The inclusion of the social links and the life sim aspect added elements of a visual novel, you could say, and those extra elements to the gameplay through the interaction of these social links. Persona 5 takes that base and continues it with a flair that I just haven't seen before. And someone whose first Persona game was 5 and now has since played 4 and 3, I have a bias towards 5. But coming from those two other incredible games, Persona 5 has problems, but also it does so much more right compared to those other games as well. Either that be slightly better or just even drastically. Objectively though, I can say that Persona 5 is far from the best Persona game. 3 or 4 could easily take that mantle, but subjectively, I just can't say no to Persona 5. And I hope that I can describe why Persona 5 is an incredibly brilliant game, even with its flaws. Before I really talk about Persona 5, well, what is it? So very roughly, there are terms you should learn about beforehand that I will use semi-regularly that involve the game deeply enough within the story and the gameplay mechanically that it would benefit you for me to tell you about. Let's start with the namesake of the game itself, Personas. Personas are a unique aspect of the Persona series, similar to how demons that worked in SMT. You don't really have to know what demons are, it's just a point of reference. Meaning that once you understand your deeper self or your shadow and accept it as a part of yourself, you can unlock the power of persona, gained from a true understanding of who you are. Now, what are shadows, you might be asking yourself? Shadows are the deeper element of yourself. If you ever heard of the Freudian concept of consciousness, then think of it as the id, the deeper level of the consciousness or the unconscious, the primitive aspect of the human experience, the primal desires, the primal needs, the impulses, the wants, etc. Desires are an important aspect of Persona 5 in scope, but not entirely on a wider Persona franchise scope. Besides the rather idiotic nature of Freud in the world of psychology, these concepts are pretty fundamental, but not entirely correct. They do offer a pretty simplistic idea of what Persona at least is about. Now, palaces are a split on the idea and how personas work in the said universe. Without spoiling too much, think of palaces of the manifestation of powerful desires. A palace that has grown from a person's distorted desires that has overtaken the cause of a self-traumatic event that changed them in their past. Persona as well is deeply connected towards the idea of friendship and the connections you make, namely called social links or confidants. Social links or confidants are both a narrative and a gameplay mechanic. As you progress through the overall narrative, you gain access to more confidants to spend your time with, and the more time you spend with a specific confidant, the more you grow connected. That allows you to gain a gameplay benefit from that as well. But don't worry, we be getting much more into detail about this later on. As I've said, these are the pretty simplistic idea of how Persona, and specifically Persona 5 work. Don't take what I said as gospel, but if you haven't played before, take these as some fundamental building blocks to build upon your own time as we go along, or even better yet, play it yourself. Speaking of, I tried my best to explain enough about Persona that it doesn't ruin or spoil the major elements of the game. As always, I would much prefer that you play before you watch this video. I can't express how much I really enjoy this game and how much I would prefer you to explore and experience this extremely long game itself. And that's sort of the crux. Many people just don't have the time to put 100+ hours to spend on a single game. And if I'm the way you experience this game and you learn about it, then I hope I do my best with that as well. As much as I try not to, I will spoil a lot of major story elements, themes, character arcs, endings, etc. that will purposely ruin your experience if you haven't played before and maybe are possibly looking to do so. So as I said, this is your time to fucking skip that'll out of here if you're looking for something else or you're even looking for a reason to play it. I do highly recommend it, and if you're a fan of JRPGs or just turn-based RPGs in general, well, I feel like that's even more of a recommendation for myself. And at this point, I'm kind of worried if you haven't played it, if you are a fan of those kind of games. So I guess I'll just wait for you guys to leave because I have to do a nice funny bit to keep the other people entertained. So cool. Let's just explore what makes Persona 5 a great game and one that's also not such a great game. Gameplay in Persona 5 is a mixed bag of singularly well-designed mechanics interacting with each other and dreadfully boring or even game-breaking elements that bring an otherwise incredibly fun and interesting gameplay system down. Let me explain. The gameplay in Persona is incredibly fun. It's easily one of the best gameplay systems that has been developed in the entire franchise that I, of course, have played. I'm already a huge fan of turn-based combat, but the way that this game integrates a lot of its different mechanics that integrate well with each other offers some unique and fun ways to play how you want. With the Velvet Room and in the upgraded version of Persona 5 Royal, it offers more options to improve your personas and demons, and mechanics to enjoy the gameplay more how you want to. The gameplay for me is divided into three main parts: the turn-based gameplay, which is the majority of what the game actually is, the exploration of palaces outside of combat, and the school life sim aspect. Here I want to explore both the actual gameplay itself and then some of the mechanics that interact with it. The exploration of palaces, the overall design of palaces as dungeons, and how I feel about each one. And lastly, how Royal changed them for the better. How the school life aspect fits into the game as a whole, both interacting with and outside of the main gameplay segment, and how it feels like it's both a tedious and enjoyable experience. As for Confidants, I will be leaving those to its own part as there's a lot to delve into, especially involving the narrative, and it's hard to talk about gameplay with that without involving the narrative, so I'm just going to leave that to that. The aspects of this gameplay can be deep, but also not at the same time. And right there is straight to the main problem I have: just how easy it is. I'm not a Souls Andy that craves how difficult my game is so I can brag about it later on, and please don't take that seriously. Yet, I do like a bit of challenge in my games at times, especially with turn-based gameplay where strategy is a key component in clearing a fight. It's just too easy even on the harder difficulties, and maybe this is where it's different in Merciless, which of course I just haven't tried. But do I need to have the hardest difficulty to have a modicum of challenge throughout the game? Personally, I just don't think so. And what I'm trying to say shouldn't take away from how people should be able to enjoy any game they want, however they want at the end of the day. We are all very different and have different use cases and experiences that can affect how we enjoy games. Disability as well is a huge aspect to consider as accessibility in games. The difficulty option is accessibility as well as a gameplay option, but still, to me, that doesn't change how easy the game can be. From what I'm able to understand and explain, it comes down to just the amount of mechanics that make it easier and easier for you to improve your personas and characters to the point of no return in difficulty. I was multiple times over-leveled for the palaces/dungeons I went into, and just being able to rush through without any real challenge to about halfway through a dungeon isn't fun or a great way to start a whole new gameplay environment. The Velvet Room, for example, is a great experience, and I love improving and upgrading my personas. But the Fusion Alarm added in the Royal Edition is a weird design aspect that I both like and don't at the same time. The Fusion Alarm is, well, an alarm that appears after you defeat a random amount of enemies in a palace. It both serves as a way to drastically increase the power of newly fused personas and already fused personas. And it's a great way to break up the pace of the gameplay so that you can go back to the beginning and save your progress. In the original game, I didn't have a small number of times where I would forget to save, or there would be a long distance between save rooms to save. And then when you die, that is one of the worst feelings to have. Me personally, I hate doing things again after I just did them. It's incredibly demotivating. That aspect I 100% get, and honestly, I find it's a smart way to allude to the player in a more non-intrusive way to save or take a break and improve your personas while you're at it. The problem that arises to me is that it's another added mechanic that makes the gameplay even easier than it already should be. And with further confidant abilities, you can make them appear at will and at an increased rate, further increasing that divide between yourself and the game. As you might have noticed, I mentioned confidant abilities, and while I'm not delving into confidants in a narrative element or even in their own gameplay sense, the confidant abilities, gameplay-wise, have massive ramifications. I love that they combined the sim-like aspects outside of dungeons to influence the gameplay itself. Other games have done this, it's nothing revolutionary, but doesn't need to be something that I think it's worth praising. It becomes that some confidant abilities are just completely broken and ruin the flow of the gameplay experience. One that I'm sure you know if you've played before is the ability where you can rush through enemies at a low enough level that you don't have to go through a battle, especially in elements like Mementos, which is a procedurally generated dungeon that is available throughout the game and in between the more scripted and planned out dungeons. But back on track, this ability is but a multitude that fundamentally changed the gameplay to something that removes the challenge. This specific ability and more others without context is like this, but with context, it's both a way to reward the player and give them something that removes tedium and grinding from the game. Well, maybe not actual grinding, but more so in Mementos where doing battle after battle it can become a slog. I mean, at the same time though, if I can just skip battles, well, yeah, I can force grinding in such an expedient way that I can level up way faster than I would beforehand, since I don't have to spend that time actually doing the battle to grind. I think they can figure out a way to properly balance this specific confidant ability by, I think, increasing the level difference between being able to use this ability and not. I think only limited to Mementos as well, because it can be used in palaces, and I think that definitely diminishes some of the gameplay value and fun that can be experienced, and it definitely becomes a problem as you get later and later into the game. Further alluding to the problem of levels and gameplay difficulty. I don't even want to get into some of the other abilities, more so because I feel like it kind of just be the same argument, and I feel like I've already made my point that some of the confidant abilities can ruin the gameplay. The gameplay is incredibly fun. I would never say otherwise at this point. A reason it's fun is that foundational aspect of the core design. The flare of the abilities going off is a treat to the eyes, and the turn-based combat is a joy to experience. Yet it's sort of for the same reason that the gameplay can lose its luster after a while. The amount of different mechanics and ways to improve yourself both in the dungeons and out are great, but they further add to the element of lesser and lesser difficulty. To me, there almost seems to be two different games or even game designs going on at the same time. One where the game doesn't expect you to involve yourself with these other mechanics to improve your gameplay, and on the other hand, the game kind of expects you to do them, because then why else would they exist in the first place? To be other engaging and fun elements of the gameplay outside of the turn-based combat. But if the turn-based combat itself doesn't reflect that you're involving yourself in these elements to improve yourself, then it kind of feels weird in a way. I like the elements where there are a ton of different ways to improve your characters, but when the game doesn't feel like if it cares or not, well then I feel like I shouldn't care, only for my own self-reasoning, and not the game's own reasonings. I don't think the game is fundamentally flawed. I think it's flawed because it tries to do so much without integrating them all in the best perfect way. I know this game is meant for a lot of people, and a lot of people experience games differently, and that is an extremely difficult task to complete. I do love what they did with the gameplay overall, and to me it's some of the best in the entire series. But of course, I hope they can do better in the future. I think there's always room to improve from previous experiences and improve upon them. And even if they don't, I think what they have here is really, really good. The fundamentals of gameplay are vital, but alongside them, the level design, or in this case, dungeon design, has to work alongside that for the gameplay to all work. Gameplay design and level design, in my eyes, work hand in hand to create the overall gameplay. I don't think it's always equal, but I don't think that devalues the work that developers do in creating the level that complements the gameplay style and the minutia of gameplay design. The palace designs do change in quality throughout the game. The first few dungeons, of course, both Kamashido and Madarame, in my opinion, are pretty good. Kamashido's palace is a good introductory dungeon to get new players introduced to the gameplay and palaces. Madarame takes that and gives it a more unique taste. Futaba's palace is pretty alright in terms of gameplay. Some of the mobs really aren't that fun to play against because of their insta-kill abilities that can just end your game almost immediately if you're unlucky. Some of the puzzles are pretty okay. It definitely has some of the more better puzzles in the entire game. I like this palace much more for its story reasons than for its own gameplay reasons. Then you get to Akumura's palace, which is more near the middle-ish of the game, so around 40 to 50-ish hours depending. In the original game, it is incredibly grueling to go through, and even though I really like the aesthetics, the gameplay felt overly forced and repetitive. It didn't feel that different throughout, but it wasn't nearly as bad in the case of Shido's palace. If I had to pick at least one palace that I disliked the most and I would care for a rework, it would definitely be Shido's or Akumura's. But Royal does change Akumura's palace a fair amount from what I last remember original being, so I will give it a lot of praise for that. Shido's palace has a major problem of very narrow and similar looking areas that make it feel like a maze to go through. It has a pretty uninspired look to me, unlike the other palaces that feel a little more out of this world crazy. This one is kind of just a yacht, and it hardlines that pretty much throughout. If I said I didn't look at the minimap throughout most of this dungeon, I would just be straight out lying, because I did, and I did a lot, as it was kind of the only way I could tell where the fuck I was going 99% of the time. Besides that, most of the dungeons have puzzles you have to solve to progress further. Some have really interesting and unique puzzles, while most are to the point of being incredibly simple. Like, how is this even a puzzle simple? Sei's Palace has some of the most fun and unique puzzles in the entire game, especially near the end of the palace, where it takes some more unique paths and gives you some forced maze-like elements where you can barely see and you have to escape with enemies rolling about, and the 1v1 was kind of fun and pretty interesting, if once again a bit easy, but it was definitely more of a challenge than other puzzles. While others, like in Shido's, either don't feel like puzzles at all or are just incredibly annoying to deal with. Bosses are also, of course, a major element of dungeon design. What else would you do once you finish a dungeon other than fight a big boss that takes everything you learned from that dungeon and throw it at you at once? Well, the bosses, and by comparison, mini-bosses, are well designed in a gameplay and like artistic sense, but once again, difficulty always seems to creep up. I found a lot of the bosses to be well designed in the way that they're interesting to fight, and the dynamic of learning them as you go along is really fun. But if I can beat a boss in the first go without having any idea what its mechanics and fight moves are, well, I just don't think that's really a good thing to have. And that's basically how I felt for every boss fight, except for like one. And if you've played the game before, I'm pretty sure you know what boss fight I'm talking about. The Akumura final boss is pretty much a massive wall of difficulty that I wanted to see more, but that doesn't really appear much afterwards. Instead of other bosses that are you versus one boss, which usually is the palace ruler himself, the person you're trying to change the heart of. Where Akuma's final boss is instead an ad boss. And if you don't know what that means, think of it as basically where you fight enemies enemies that aren't the actual palace ruler himself. Instead, you go through wave after wave of mobs till you beat them all. Here, Akuma isn't that much of a challenge. In truth, he is a pushover, but the whole difficulty comes from the ads that you have to fight. You are pushed against a timer. Well, actually, it's 2 timers. There is the actual fight timer that lasts a pretty long time, and really you shouldn't have that much of a problem with it. The other timer though is a real fucking bitch and a half. Each of the ads will go through their turns till Akuma gives them the order to self-destruct, and that will completely wipe that ad out and hurt you in turn. So you have to kill that ad when it appears very quickly, or you'd be taking a lot of damage you don't need to take. But that isn't the worst of it. The icing on the cake is that you have to kill all the ads at the same time, or they will retreat and restart that phase. And by restart, I mean it restart. All the ads that didn't get killed will run off, and all the same ads will respawn again with full health. So it's a real battle against the timer of basically restarting the phase for you and being able to kill them all equal at the same time. This boss fight is infamous for being one of the toughest in the entire game, if not the actual toughest. It was the only fight that I actually died in and had to plan out much more deliberately than I normally would. I loved it and hated it at the same time. It was that difficulty that I craved for the game to give me, and that satisfaction and relief I got from beating him was pretty ecstatic. Yet, it was also incredibly annoying to deal with, and in truth, it definitely does feel a bit overtuned, even in Royal, especially for that part of the game. It's not like it's an increasing level of difficulty in that dungeon, it's more of a dramatic increase compared to the previous dungeons and boss fights. I definitely would have liked more of this difficulty to happen more and be a bit more smoothed out, but I do 100% understand the frustration with this boss fight, and don't worry, I definitely felt that as well. It's definitely one of the more fun elements of the game because of that difficulty, where you actually feel challenged, whereas most of the other boss fights can be challenging, but fundamentally are pretty simple to go through. With all that out of the way, the gameplay of Persona 5 isn't as cut and dry as I make it seem to be, or honestly, as I would have liked it to be. It has a lot of benefits compared to the previous games, but it follows that similarity of difficulty, which in truth diminished it a bit more than I would even like to admit. The amount of mechanics that you can interact with is honestly really good. It offers a lot of different ways to improve your characters both in and out, but they don't all feel properly balanced or implemented in a way that doesn't ruin the flow of the gameplay to the extent that is noticeable for a large amount of people. Somehow that really doesn't ruin the fun. To me, it proves my long-held belief that difficulty doesn't equal fun, and vice versa. They interact and influence each other, of course, but I wouldn't be asking for a harder game if I didn't think it would be more fun to be challenged in some aspects. But that's of course for me, and that doesn't make it a displeasure to play, even for me or especially for other people. It just sort of makes it more of a lesser experience in some areas. Boss fights can be fun without being incredibly difficult. Similarly, a boss can be completely unfun even if it is difficult. It's a balance, like many elements in game design, and I feel like Persona hits that balance but falters more than it should. It's a bit of a wobbly balance, but it's a balance nonetheless that somehow keeps itself together. But at the end of the day, it's honestly a blast to play. But that difficulty and that aspect of the challenge is definitely missing from a lot of areas of the game without delving into merciless or forcing yourself to hold back, which I don't think is overly engaging to play, but that doesn't take away that it's fun to play still. I just think it's missing an aspect that makes it continually engaging. A story is not much without characters to get you interested and engage with the narrative flows and themes pouring throughout. Persona is rather infamous for its confidants and sim-esque systems. While it wasn't a staple of the series in the beginning, now in the modern age of JRPGs and Persona specifically, it has become a core pillar of the gameplay and narrative design of Persona, and much so around Persona 5. You have multiple different characters to interact with, with. Not all are equal in quality, and some are even hated by the wider community, and don't worry, I will definitely talk about them. But as I said, Confidants offer both a gameplay mechanic and a narrative element to engage with. Confidants are usually their own self-contained story arc centered around a major theme / arcana. Let me explain shortly what an arcana is specifically in the terms of Persona 5. In Persona, there are 22 major arcana and usually around 22 confidants in each game, more or less. Persona 5 Royal adds a couple of new ones that are specific to that game, and with each re-release version of a Persona game, usually has done a couple more confidants. But each major arcana is supposed to represent the big picture of your life and the steps someone makes throughout their life. For example, the full arcana is the start of a new journey, letting go of preconceived ideas and being more open to change, reminding us to be open towards the journey of self-change and self-realization. Each player character in Persona, in the modern ones at least, carries the 4 arcana, representing the start of your journey towards the end of the world arcana, understanding your true self and allowing for realization. Now, I really won't be going into the real life arcana stuff. Believe what you will, but that shit is just kind of hocus pocus to me. But back on track, in Persona at least, they do have major meanings and lessons for basically every character you meet. Social links or confidants are the core of this system. It's the more you get to know them and become closer to them, the more you gain knowledge of their specific arcana and then can use their specific confidant abilities to create more personas relating to that arcana. Now, I don't think delving into every single confidant is worth the effort or time. I will only mostly be talking about the ones I find that are worth talking about in the first place, mostly the main cast and a few of the side characters. What I feel is both good and bad about them, and trying to dissect what it's really trying to talk about. I will be leaving the new confidants added Royal for their own section, as I feel it would be better placed there. I will also be going in the best order I find appropriate. So first, the main cast, and then to the ones I feel are worth talking about that are outside of the main cast. The Chariot Arcana. Ryuji is one of the first characters you meet and becomes a founding member of the Phantom Thieves. His confidant mostly deals with his overlaying guilt surrounding the track team and how he feels he was the cause of the disbandment from Kamoshida. While this one feels a bit less deep than the other ones do, I think it is still a good complement to Ryuji's overall character arc in the main narrative. The Chariot Arcana means looking forward to new movements of change as a way forward, and I think that perfectly represents the theme and idea around his story. It's about forgiveness and the power of letting the past go and looking forward to new changes. Personally though, it is definitely one of the weaker ones of the main cast, but I don't think that means I disliked it in any real meaningful way. I do think it's a good compliment to Ryuji's main story character, but I feel like it does go a bit too fast at times, and while it does leave a satisfying conclusion, I don't think it all feels that great. It also gives you one of the most broken confidant abilities in the entire game, and I think that'll always be something to disagree with. The Lover's Arcana. An as well is one of the founding members of the Phantom Thieves, joining after being subjugated to the trauma of Kamoshida's palace, so right off the bat, I do have to say that An is as well one of the weaker confidants. But I do think a confidant does try to deal with some of the aspects that I do like. The Lover's Arcana means looking for creative solutions that help you commit to your duties fully. And while I think that does explain her storyline, I do also think it's the problem I have with it. It feels a bit unfocused and all over the place. While it does have a core theme, that theme and how it's expressed can be a bit muddled at times. I think I can see what their ideas were with her confidant, trying so many different things while either missing the point and or finding your way to the path and commitments you have. This one has more problems than Ryuji did. I like the theme just as much. Growing as a person is not as simple as doing the things that make you quote unquote stronger. It's a process that takes a lot of effort. It's just that it loses what it's trying to say in the muddled aspects of her confidant. Switching from her gig as a model to Shiho to doing many other things to grow stronger, it doesn't connect as well as I would have liked, and it leaves the conclusion a bit more dissatisfying than I would have liked it to be. The Emperor's Arcana. Yusuke is quite the odd character, but his confidant is honestly one of the better ones in the entire main cast. Yusuke comes in through Madarami's palace after seeing the real man lying underneath the facade of the welcoming and caring father figure he thought he knew. Afterwards, you can help him rekindle that love for art, or more so, find inspiration again after such a painfully traumatic event that changed his entire opinion on art and its creative endeavors. Following the Emperor Arcana, Yusuke tries to find inspiration or strength from outside resources, from other people. Almost given into becoming another people to someone at first that doesn't care about art in general. Instead, finding the strength and resources within himself to create again, and make something that truly speaks from his heart, from the experiences he has gained from working with the Phantom Thieves. In honest, Yusuke is a character I always had a hard time connecting with, making it difficult to complete his confidant on the multiple different playthroughs I've done. But now since I've done it, it's really a beautiful story of finding self and finding inspiration, that the human heart and desire itself are both beautiful and vile things to behold. It gives us a lot more insight into who Yusuke is as a person, and seeing him realize what it means to be an artist and find the passion for his craft again. It definitely was one of the best confidants of the main cast. The Priestess Arcana. Makoto really is a mixed bag of a confidant. It really somehow doesn't help her character as much as it should have. Even in An's case, which I said I had problems with, we did see a deeper level into the character that we didn't get to see in the main story, and we even got to a conclusive point where they understood some deeper level of themselves. Now, I'm not saying Makoto doesn't have any of that. There are a couple of scenes where we can learn a bit about her father and how she feels about that. We get to get a deeper understanding of her, but it's definitely not as much as I would have liked, and even the ending is a bit unconclusive. The Priestess Arcana follows a value of self-cultivation as the most important aspect of a routine. I do think this fits Makoto's overall character, but I think her confidant storyline falls short in trying to tell whatever this type of story is. The problem is that her confidant follows mostly Ayako, Makoto's new friend, and her rather suspicious boyfriend, whom after a bit of digging, we know not to be in such a good crowd. Instead of actually focusing on Makoto as a character, maybe her sense of justice, maybe even her family name, or really anything else to do with her actual character development, we deal with this relationship which at a lot of times feels like it's putting Makoto in the backdrop of her own confidant. The Hermit Arcana. Futaba is an interesting character. Instead of joining you from the deep connection to the person you are stealing the heart from, it is instead Futaba you are tasked to change the heart of. A deeply secluded person after the death of her mother right in front of her eyes. She's been in the quote-unquote hermit state for years since, and then contacts you to steal her heart under her own hacker alias. Her confidant afterwards deals with her coming to terms with her own mother's death and the real circumstances behind it, trying to come out of her shell and grow from being the secluded person she is to someone that can go do things herself and become more of an independent person. The Hermit Arcana deals with giving yourself time to think about life and not allowing others to stand in your way. Her main character arc follows this pretty well when she starts to come to her own senses and begins to grow from the person she thinks is the reason her mother died to understanding that her mother loved her very much, even though she cared about her work a lot more often. She gives time to come to terms with this and doesn't allow other people to get in the way of what she wants to do. Her confidant as well is pretty good at this, at least in the beginning half. It takes great strength to say that you want to improve yourself and even more to try and do it. It's about halfway through when the story starts to take a shift towards an old friend that Futaba had and wants to right wrongs in the past, changing the hearts of her friend's parents that use it as a way to pay off gambling debts. I want to talk about the use of mementos as a confidant advance later, but overall it seems that there is a noticeable shift in the way the story is progressing. Between the shut in Futaba and learning and growing herself to interact with the real world, and then her friend and her then coming out to right those wrongs that she felt she inflicted in the past. It again feels a bit unfocused more times than I would have liked, but I did enjoy the confidant story of Futaba and learning more about her as a character, even though it can be a bit on the nose at times. The Empress Arcana. Haru is the daughter of Okumura. She joins after a rather interesting interaction with Morgana, and don't worry, we'll definitely be getting to him in just a bit. But he leaves after a confrontation and you try to slowly get him back into the team, and Haru alongside him. Haru, after dealing with her own father and the circumstances that happen afterwards, is put into the difficult position of running the family company. The problem with Haru's confidant is that it feels just way too late in the game, especially in the original. She is placed near the end of the original game, and it becomes difficult to do her confidant without feeling like you have to rush it, and leaving out others that you might be more interested in. Royal fixes this problem a bit, but it's still a pretty deeply fundamental problem with giving us new main characters this late into the main story. The Empress Arcana follows the lessons of learning to lean on other people, and not being tough on yourself for not being capable of the task ahead. Instead, knowing that leaning on other people is what allows you to facilitate these new outcomes that weren't possible beforehand. Besides the timing with this confidant, I really enjoyed it, and that makes it even worse that I never felt like it was worth it to do her confidant because it just was way too late in the game. She is trying to run a company and do her regular school activities weighing heavily on her, alongside a forced marriage even after the circumstances of her family business is still in effect as far as she is aware. She starts to become paranoid of everyone in the company, for perfectly reasonable reasons. But once she sits down and talks it out, she can lean on other people that she can trust, facilitating these new possibilities for the company and especially for herself. The Magician Arcana. Morgana as well is one of the founding members of the Phantom Thieves. Instead of having to interact with his character out of story or gameplay elements, his confidant ranks up throughout the game, forcing a full rank on you even if you have nothing to do with him. Morgana's character and his confidant storyline aren't really separate from each other. His confidant ranks up in direct relationship with what happens in the main story. He is a very debated character, and honestly, I can see why. His character, as it starts, is very, well, annoying and just kind of a straight up asshole. You don't really start on the right foot, and so immediately you have the harder task of making this character as understandable and likable. And for many people, it falls short. The Magician Arcana is about trusting yourself. You are smarter than you're giving yourself credit for. I can already see how this would turn people off, given how this Arcana fits within Morgana's personality. It's hard to get rid of first impressions, and there's a reason why many people still think of him as the arrogant, cocky, and just incredibly annoying cast member. The best scene to delve in with Morgana is of course the Akuma decision, where he storms out after a long period of starting to feel more and less important to the group as a whole. There are many problems I have with this scene in particular, but I did like the conceptual aspect of it. Disagreement or tension between the Phantom Thieves were sort of missed throughout, and I would have liked to see more of that. These are a group of children that have been wronged by society, and to me it's sort of crazy to think that they haven't really disagreed on a target yet. But Morgana's reasons are muddled for a lot of people, and even myself, for a rather long time. It is one of the main contributing factors to why people dislike him as a character. Him storming off is seen as a childish action, and to me for very good reasons. I thought, as others still do, that Morgana left because of Ryuji. While I think that might be a contributing factor, I think it's far from the underlying reasons why he left in the first place. But I think even if the group had more tension in it, I still think that the scene wouldn't really work to its full potential. Morgana's character really doesn't fit this kind of decision. Throughout the game, Morgana has been known not to take unnecessary risks, and leaving and infiltrating a palace all by himself is far from the character he is built up to be. It's hard to like Morgana, but I do think I like some of his character moments. I can still see why people dislike him as much as they do, but I don't think he deserves as much hate as he gets. It's a very, very flawed character arc. Well, I think it's one where there's enough to see where it should have gone to. I greatly enjoyed much of the main cast, and I definitely will be talking more about them later on in the overall scope of the main narrative. Their confidant storylines are a major element of their character arc and overall personality. Some do it better than others, and others fall flat for an otherwise good character. Being able to connect deeper with the main cast members should always be a boon than not. None of the confidants are really bad. I think far from it, honestly. It's just that when you compare it to each other, you can see where some fall shorter than others. Futaba versus Haru, for example. Futaba has a weirdly split confidant storyline, but Haru instead has many different elements happening at the same time, but it still keeps to that central focus a lot more clearly than with Futaba's. I did like the continued ties to major arcana, but at times it definitely does feel like it limited them in what they could do, alongside that fact that they were restricted to 10 quote-unquote episodes to fill out the character arc outside of the main story. Persona has always had this problem with telling instead of showing, where there's a time and a place for that. Instead of showing us major elements that happened in these confidants, it is more so told, alongside many other problems that overall show some lackluster design. Besides the main cast, there are many other confidants that you meet throughout your adventures and can gain a deeper connection with. Some are infinitely better than others, while some are interesting to talk about for the things it tries to talk about but fails at, much like some of the main cast. As I've said, I don't think talking about every confidant will be completely worth it, as some are just not that interesting or worthwhile to talk about. While I know this isn't a fully comprehensive overview, I feel like creating a brief of the different types of confidants offers the same kind of idea instead of boring you by talking about confidant 19 instead of the more interesting confidant number 20 to say. Something like like that is where I'm coming from. But enough with that. Let's start with the Hierophant Arcana. Sojiro Sakura, better known as Boss, takes you in after your fateful circumstances that lead to your current situation. Being your caretaker while your 10 scored Suchin Academy, aside from his confidant, I really enjoy Sojiro as a character. He fits that quote-unquote dad character pretty well, and it becomes difficult to hate him after you start to learn about him and what he's been through. His confidant follows that similar idea. At first he is distant from you, but as you try and connect more with him by helping around, nothing really dramatic happens in his confidant until around halfway mark when an old relative of Futaba comes in demanding payments, or he will take Futaba, seemingly knowing he'll win any court case because of his blood relation to Futaba, and Sojiro being nothing more than a guardian with no blood relation. Before I get my thoughts on the overall confidant, I feel like there's that problem again with his confidant that Futaba had, and it's that problem with having almost two separate story angles going in. The first half of the confidant has barely anything meaningful going on besides nice character interactions between you and Sojiro that hint towards future elements of the story. You are then locked out till you have Futaba in your party, and then the actual story happens, where Sojiro starts to understand that he needs to take action for Futaba instead of laying low and letting things run their course. I really want to like this confidant more than I think I do. The later half is leagues better than the front half in delivering a meaningful and attaching story with Sojiro and his understanding that he needs to protect what he has, or better yet, take action to keep what he has. He has always cared for Futaba, but their relationship has been strained due to Futaba's situation with being a shut-in. It's only when you take Futaba away from that and show Sojiro a new perspective that he learns his lesson. I feel like if you took Sojiro's second half as confidant and gave it more room to delve more into that relationship between him and Futaba's mother, and allow that growth of him learning to take action to his own hands and protect what he has to fester more than it did. It's definitely one of my more favorite confidants conceptually, but I don't think it really harbors that full potential it had. The Sun Arcana. Yoshida was as well one that I never really did in my first couple of runs. The way to access his confidant is a bit more convoluted even when I had an idea how to do it, but it's well worth the reward when you get one of the best confidants in the entire game. Yoshida is a former member of the National Diet, the legislative branch of Japan, being disgraced from that position after a national scandal with the embezzlement of funds alongside multiple other charges given him the nickname No Good Torah, something that he continues to deal with even during the events of his confidant, even freezing up during his speeches when someone yells at that nickname. When you meet Yoshida, he is trying to steer the country in a better direction, one that cares for the citizens and its people more than the material or non-popular interest. What makes his confidant so good, in my eyes, is the continued focus on Yoshida as his own flawed character, but one that wants to do better. Even after learning that all his scandals weren't his fault and instead placed upon him by his former mentor, he declines to take action against them and instead focuses on doing his own thing and improving his relationship by himself. Instead of the nickname No Good Torah keeping Yoshida down, it becomes a point of people being able to change and improve for the better, learning from the mistakes and trying to better people. Yoshida's confidant is easily one of the best ones in the entire game for its good pacing and continued focus on the political sphere of Japan and how corrupt it can be under the eyes of the current government. Yoshida is one of the few characters you meet by happenstance and figures out and even sympathizes with the Phantom Thieves early on in his confidant. As someone who can emotionally relate to wanting better change for people and changing the government to focus on elements of society that need help, Yoshida's focus on such a change, someone who stood up for what they believed in even after multiple and life-changing mistakes, but continued in the face of those odds to better change people's lives. The Moon Arcana. Mishima is a very contested character. Well, I guess I hold a more hot take perspective on this character and his confidant, but I think Mishima is actually a pretty well-written and down-earth character. I think what a lot of people miss about Mishima is that his story never tries to make him seem like someone who's supposed to be a good person. It's a hard element to explain because it's a pretty complex character design that I don't really see much in this game, at least to this degree. Mishima takes up the mantle of holding up the fan site, a website and being a forum for fans of the Phantom Thieves as well as for people to ask the Phantom Thieves for help, a gameplay reason for the request you acquire that is a main motivator for you to go and explore mementos. After a while, Mishima slowly turns corrupt from the power he seemingly holds from being the creator of the fan site, using his power to start embezzling funds that he got from donations to the website / the Phantom Thieves to ask you to take down random people to improve the fame of the thieves. You then go to Mementos, and instead of fighting his shadow as you normally do for these confidant requests, you talk to him and tell him to change himself instead of relying on the Phantom Thieves to solve his own problems. It's really an element we never really see in the game. We don't change his heart, he changes his own heart, slowly but surely coming to terms with what he has done, but further going with a better view on life. Through this scene in Mementos, videos, you see what makes to me Mishima a good character. Before the whole fan side, Mishima was a loner, an outcast, bullied, and really had Stockholm syndrome towards his bullies and abusers. It's when he aligns himself with the Phantom Thieves, he gains a sense of grandiose power where he isn't the quote-unquote zero he was called beforehand, but actually someone. It then only makes sense as to why Mishima would learn for the same attention and praise the Phantom Thieves were getting, and try to take that or align himself to that in a way that changes what he originally believed in when he first supported them. I guess I really still don't get how people really hate this character. To me, it's one of the more compelling character arcs in the game, someone who is pretty relatable even if some people deny that reality, and through greed or self-loathing goes down the wrong path and becomes this person he hated in the first place. Instead of fighting him to change his heart, we force him to learn where he went wrong and change himself for the better. And he does, becoming the person he wants to be, instead of forcefully associating himself with people that would give him the power or attention he wants after years of abuse and bullying. He's not meant to be a stoic hero, he's a normal person who is led astray by the power he once held. I'm not saying you have to like him, but I think rather you should have a different perspective on him as a character instead of the more preconceived notions. I do think he's a well-written character that goes through a change that isn't seen a lot in the other different Confidants.
The Temperance Arcana. Kawakami is your homeroom school teacher that you meet after hours as a Cullen maid. As you slowly get to know her better and better, and as you continue to request her services, you can start to understand why she's doing this in the first place. She gives the reasons for paying for her own sister's illness, but as that facade ends around halfway through her Confidant, she tells you that that was a lie, and instead, it's to pay off a so-called debt that she agreed to as a way to repay the relatives of a student she taught that passed away in a car accident. I really enjoyed what they tried to do with this Confidant. It's a teacher that tried to do her best for her students, especially one that was struggling in school due to his financial concerns. So Kawakami helps him after hours in her own free time, but in some association with that, the student dies in a car accident. Kawakami deals with her trauma and blames herself for trying to help him in the first place, and the student's relatives coerce her into paying off a debt, in turn keeping her job as a teacher. I think the problem that arises from this Confidant with me isn't the story that's being told per se, because I actually think it's pretty interesting and conceptually well designed, but I think the pacing is a bit more so all over the place, and I think there were multiple times where it builds up to Kawakami being overworked and stressed and being sent to the hospital, where I feel like that could have been better placed to associate those scenes and that entire element into the storyline that progresses the plot and keeps it better paced and not as ham-fisted. But other than that, I think besides some of the weird relationship tropes at times, I think this Confidant has some pretty compelling themes of forgiving yourself and not letting the past hold you back from continuing what you believe in.
The Hangman Arcana. EY is a shady airsoft store owner deep in the corner of Shibuya that you meet as a way to acquire weapons in your fight in the palaces and mementos. You can work for him, and doing so leads you to learn about the shady backstory of him and what he's dealing with from his past. I'm honestly saddened that I never did this Confidant before replaying this game for the Royal Edition. It is definitely one of the better Confidants in the game, and with how fleshed out his character and his son Kairu becomes. I wasn't expecting to have to deal with the facts of adoption and Yakuza dealings in the same storyline, but here we are, I guess. I guess there really isn't much to explain that really isn't in the Confidant itself, but I really enjoy the relationship between EY and Kairu, and how EY feels like he isn't a real father to Kairu due to not him being blood related. How by the end, Kairu, even after learning about the truth of his real parents, still sees EY as a father to him and someone who he can trust. EY was always scared of Kairu learning the truth and leaving him or hating him for not being his real father and lying to him. Kairu instead, when he is kidnapped, says that it's all in the past and he won't let what happened then ruin their relationship now. The build up to this relationship and revelation and the drama surrounding the Yakuza dealing is pretty compelling and was kind of a joy to experience. I love a good character that tries to do the right thing for the person they care about, and EY fits that bill perfectly. The Star Arcana. Hifumi is a master Soji player that you meet playing by herself in a church. By expressing interest in wanting to play Soji while being a complete novice, you can start to fester an interesting relationship of master and apprentice, and slowly learn more behind the scenes. I really don't have a lot to say about Hifumi, but what makes it interesting to talk about is what conceptually happens. A mother that strives to push herself into the spotlight through her own daughter, and while what they do is good in the Confidant, it honestly just isn't that great overall. I feel like her character arc happens a little too fast. Instead of focusing that losing that confidence and trying to regain it slowly and push herself to become better and worthy of a champion in her own right, it happens a little too fast near the end. And yeah, there is some insecurities in the beginning, but I don't think that's worthy enough of a huge character arc as she deserved. The the Death Arcana. Kai Takemaki is a back alley doctor you meet as a way to gain access to meds and other treatments to improve your abilities in the metaverse. As you spend more time with her, you slowly learn about her dark past and what she's striving to do as you continue to be her experiment subject. I think this is another one of the great confidants. With every aspect of the story we experience important to the overall character arc. When we get deep enough of a relationship, you learn that Takemaki is trying to produce a drug that would save patients from a disease that killed her last patient, a child named Miwa. And never being able to let that go, is disgraced from the medical community and is forced to become a back alley doctor where she continues to find a way to treat or cure the illness that took the life of this young girl. When she is confronted by the head of the medical community, she is forced to stop her research or be fully kicked out of the medical community and lose her license to practice. We, of course, force a change of heart out of him to change his ways and make sure Takemaki isn't kicked out because we have a personal connection to her and we need the meds. Boy, we need to take those drugs. What we learn instead now is that fantastical twist is that Miwa, the child that Takemaki thought died under her care, is in fact alive and was just transferred to another hospital as a way to force Takemaki out. This confidant does both elements incredibly well, having an interesting and understandably tragic character and having a deep connection to us as a character, allowing us to improve her life. But what I really found interesting about Takemaki is that she was doing all this work before we even came in, meaning that she was trying to work all on her own on a treatment. We don't start what was the defining moment in her character arc, we are just the way it finishes. Now, I know I left out some confidants that are pretty good themselves, and some of the more weaker ones, and maybe a couple of interesting ones. But I really just wanted to stop before I explained every single confidant. And I really just came into this wanting to talk about the more interesting ones that I feel were worth at least some detail. But I would be lying if I didn't say I enjoyed to some extent most of these confidants. While I have problems with specific confidants, and these are the ones I usually talked about, and some of the more overlike nature of social links in this game in general, I don't think it really detracts from what is expressed in these stories. Every character in this game has been in some way wronged by society or some injustice. It makes sense that this would be in the case as the whole game's narrative theme surround injustice and fighting against said injustice. A slight problem becomes when you can see the formulaic nature in play though. There are some major issues of pacing in the showing/telling I was talking about with many of the different confidants. Too many feel like they both go too fast and too slow, doing different aspects of the storylines in ways that hamper otherwise interesting and compelling character moments. Yet the ones that spark her throughout are worth praising and show that these devs and writers know how to exude a deeply personal and interesting story. The main story is divided into multiple different arcs with different themes and situations for each of them. But overall, there is that constant underlying tone of injustice and fighting against such injustice. The way that the story is told is from a flashback perspective, where you are retelling the events told while in an interrogation room with Sai. It's a great way to hook the player in right after a heist that plays off on your unknowing knowledge of what is happening. The problem that can arise from this narrative structure is how they implement it throughout the rest of the story. As it is a flashback, whenever you form a new link with a confidant, start and a new arc, or just really whenever else, you are sucked back into the interrogation room, at times killing the pacing by abruptly stopping what you are doing. It also for some reason spoils the next major characters you're going to be going after, ruining any sort of surprise or suspense. There are times in the story where using this flashback structure works in favor of the narrative, but those are few in scale compared to how many times it hampers down the overall storyline. But besides all of that, when the story tries to tell through the multiple different arcs on an overall scale with the Phantom Thieves as a group and as individuals is pretty good and interesting. As I've said, the main story is divided into multiple different arcs surrounding the targets you decide. Overall, the quality is decent and none of them are atrocious, but there are some weaker ones. The first target of the Phantom Thieves is their high school coach, Kamoshida, seemingly a very normal and talented professional, even a winner of an Olympic gold medal, to which he proudly brings up and talks about constantly. As I've said, Kamoshida is the first palace we experience in the game, besides the intro, which we can pass over for now until we get to that point. The first target, or more like the first antagonist, is kind of always an interesting one to think about, for this is how the group was founded on, and was built upon with their experiences from this palace. I think what I like about this palace in general
is the nature of it being a first rodeo for the crew, minus Morgana mostly, but Joker and Ryuji at first having to figure out how this entire metaverse aspect works. Overall, I do think this palace is a rather strong start to get hooked onto the narrative flow this game has to offer in terms of palace rulers. When compared to other rulers, I guess it can be a bit flat at times with how some of the aspects are handled, but I think it's far from one of the weakest ones. I still think it's a rather strong start. This is also one of the more few palace rules where you almost consistently interact with. You still mostly interact with almost all the palace rules, but this one you constantly interact with because of the fact that you're a member of staff at the school you attend. I think it offers a bit more of a unique perspective and a much more connected experience as the horrors of what Kamoshida has done continue to pile on and we dig deeper and deeper. Those continued occurrences I think add more to a consistent motivation to change his heart. An is a core character in this arc storyline, having a real direct connection with Kamoshida and a more indirect connection through Shiho, with how Kamoshida has treated the team he is the coach of, and An being cursed more and more into doing some really disgusting favors for Kamoshida to keep Shiho on the team. A completely manipulative and disgusting action that really changes her viewpoint. When she accidentally comes into Kamoshida's palace, she is witness to what the true Kamoshida is, how he views her, the entire volleyball team, and even the entire school itself. This is when she finally awakens to her persona.
My, it's taken far too long. Tell me, who is going to avenge her if you don't? Forgiving him was never the option. Such is the scream of the other you that dwells within. I am thou, thou art I. We can finally forge a contract.
I hear you, Carmen. You're right. No more holding back.
There you go. Nothing can be solved by restraining yourself. Understand? Then I'll gladly lend you my strength.
You know what? I'm not some cheap girl you can toy with, you scumbag.
Bitch!
You stole everything from Shiho. You destroyed her. Now it's your turn. I will rob you of everything!
With the full core of the Phantom Thieves actualized, and with An in full tow as a core member, the group moves forward till they find the treasure of Kamoshida, the source of the distorted desires, wishing to send the first calling card and far from the last one. Like I've said, I do think the Kamoshida arc is rather okay and pretty good for a starting palace ruler. When you compare it to the later ones, which I will get into very shortly, it can be a bit lackluster and it doesn't really hold a full emotional weight. But I think for a first rodeo, I think it does a really good job of investing you and investing the characters into what this is going to be fully about. The next couple of palaces is where the fame of the Phantom Thieves really starts to become an element for the group to handle. It's not to the degree yet that we see, but it's definitely an element to keep in mind going forward. Monorami to me is actually pretty similar to how Kamoshida worked. I don't think it's completely similar, but it has enough different elements to feel unique and a more continued addition to the growth of the Phantoms as a group. After Kamoshida, the group can be in a bit of a weird limbo of not sure if they are both going to continue, and if so, who would be next. Kamoshida was a uniting factor for basically everyone in the group at the time. Now that aspect would sort of be lost. Who would the Phantom Thieves go after next? In this limbo, the group is on the lookout for a target, and in the short term, Madarame seems like a solid option. This is where Yusuke shows his face, as both as an in with Madarame and to find a way into his assumed palace. An has to model for Yusuke's way into his studio, in which he lives with his adopted sort of father, Madarame, who is the teacher of Yusuke's mother, who died shortly after Yusuke was born. Madarame is an incredibly popular and praised artist, mostly known for his artwork of the Sayori, a masterpiece of his career and widely praised throughout the art world. What was stolen and the real has never been found. As can be guessed, there's a lot more underneath the facade that Madarame upholds in public. As the thieves figure out the way into Madarame's palace, it shows an incredibly gaudy museum, portrayed fully in gold, a hint to his true personality. As we progress further and further into his palace, we are stopped from progressing even further, as each palace has a so-called mental block. where an aspect of reality affects the metaverse. The mental world of, in this case, Madarame. A door that no one but Madarame is allowed to open, even locked away from Yusuke. I do want to say I think there is a somewhat of a weird aspect that appears in the story. It has to do with An having to fake being the model of Yusuke. I think there was already a pretty weird aspect to bring up with this, yet it was never really an aspect I thought added a lot to the story, or I feel like it was more so pushed. But with this, Morgana is able to unlock the door, and An, as well, is able to force Yusuke into it alongside Madarame, forcing the block in his palace to open as Joker and Ryuji go through to scout it out and make sure they can get to the other side and do whatever they need to do. This is finally where Yusuke gets a view into what the man he thinks of as a father figure really is. The true man beneath the facade of Madarame. Behind the doors are copies upon copies of the Sayuri, and within it the so-called real copy. A painting long thought lost, as Madarame has said constantly. A man motivated not by their creative endeavor, but by the money that can be earned from selling fakes to people of the art world who claiming it as the real one. As Yusuke accidentally enters the metaverse alongside An and Morgana, he is forced upon the true nature of Madarame. His entire perspective and his own facade collapse, and he is forced to view upon this sight. He confronts the shadow of Madarame, which angers him to such a degree that he finally awakens to what he has always known, and his persona is brought forth.
Have you finally come to your senses? How foolishly you averted your eyes from the truth. A deplorable imitation indeed. Lest you part from that aspect of yourself. Let us now forge a contract. I am thou, thou art I. The world is filled with both beauty and vice. It is time you teach people which is which.
Very well. Come. Goemon! A breathtaking sight. Imitations they may be, but together they make a fine spectacle. Though the flowers of evil blossom, be it known, abominations are fated to perish!
Whoa, this is impressive!
Who do you think you are? The price for your insolence will be death! Where are my guards? Kill them all!
The children who adored you as father. The prospects of your pupils. How many did you trample upon? How many dreams did you exchange for riches? No matter what it takes, I will bring you to justice!
After finally defeating Madarame, with Yusuke ready to fight the shadow of the man he once thought of as a father figure, is when we finally learn that the story is a much more important piece than Madarame could ever make. It was painted by Yusuke's mother, shortly before she passed away, and the real painting shows what is a mother, and instead of the fakes, holding a child in her arm, was a sort of portrait of her and Yusuke, something that Madarame could never have created as he never had that love to that degree. Before the palace collapses, Madarame spits out something about a black masked person. Very interesting. Something to keep in mind. With his sins finally confessed, Yusuke finally has some semblance of peace, and with that, the real Sayori, and its true meaning unfolded to the light. I do like the Madarame arc a fair amount. I like what they brought with Yusuke and having a more deep connection to the palace ruler. Yusuke, as I said before, has one of the better storylines in the entire game, and this is what builds to that. It's just a really well-paced and more so interesting story that really builds on what the Kamoshida Palace was and just kind of does it better. Kanashiro was just kind of an honestly forgettable arc in terms of his palace ruler. Even with it bringing Makoto, one of my more favorite characters from the main cast, it can't save an otherwise felt aspect that is through this entire arc. I think besides the increase of target intensity from Madarame, who was the thief's first big target, to the hardened criminal of Kanashiro, who is running a criminal underground within Shibuya, who is the thief's first target that affects a multitude of people instead of being a lot more centrally focused. Using students to run packages from one place to another sounds like a rather easy job, till they force you to work for free, or they will leak what you have been doing to the police. A surefire way to ruin your entire life, so you're understandably forced to comply. Makoto, the student council president, feels obligated to investigate these circumstances these students have been finding themselves in, even with the disapproval of the principal, who has hounded asking her to find evidence on the Phantom Thieves, which she does. But instead of outing them, she gives them a proposition: help with these students who have been forced in this criminal ring, and she will delete the evidence and turn a blind eye. Prove to her their justice. As much as that would have turned out, things don't always work as you plan them to, as Makoto learns firsthand. Being a bit of a careless, stubborn person, when we find a way to find Kaneshiro and a way into his palace, which we find is locked off to us, which means we have to lift a mental block. Makoto then takes the risk of going straight ahead and risking her own life in the process, finding Kaneshiro, which then puts her and the entire group in a very dangerous and time-limiting situation. Kaneshiro used this fact and has evidence of them with copious amounts of drugs and alcohol, which, if leaked, would ruin their entire lives. Much of the same tactic he is very much known for using. Afterwards, we are finally able to get into Kaneshiro's palace, and finally where we meet the man himself. Seeing everyone around him is a source of constant cash, nothing more than cash cows to steal from, as he deems fit, as is right. Makoto hears more and more of what this man is, becoming fully enraged and finally finding her justice once again.
Have you decided to tread the path of strife?
Yes. Come to me!
Very well. Let us proceed with our contract at once. I am thou. Thou art I. You have finally found your own justice. Please, never lose sight of it again. This memorable day marks your graduation from your false self.
What the hell?
A persona?
No, dude. That's a bike.
I can feel it. Myself. Me! Got it!
Wow! Nice! What is that? I've never seen anything like it.
You better earn your keep, or else I'll kill you!
I will not lose heart again. Ever. I'll go full speed, non-stop. Right, Johanna?
Not much really happens afterwards. It's definitely a more straightforward affair towards the end, and changing his heart with Makoto in tow is a fully fledged member of the Phantom Thieves. We start to get a little bit more information about who or what this black masked persona is, but Kaneshiro is either too scared or too low on the ladder to really say anything meaningful. Really, this arc is just forgettable, and I really don't have much else to say besides how it links with Makoto and her entire awakening arc, which I do think is the only real element that I like to any real degree. To this day, I just really don't see how this palace fits into the overall narrative. Madarame's was the thieves' first real big target, and afterwards is when the popularity of the thieves becomes a real issue to handle. Kaneshiro's is kind of stuck in the middle of that, and that sort of leaves him with a rather lackluster palace that's not overly terrible, but just mostly forgettable. This next palace is rather interesting for I think a number of reasons. One, with how it's written itself, with a more unique twist on the formula so far, and secondly, that aspect I alluded to before with the flashback narrative divide. Instead of the more usual fare of being told who your target is going to be during the beginning of a new arc with a flashback to the interrogation room, instead we are given what is truly not our actual target, but what we still need to fight against. The hacker group Medjed has declared war on the Phantom Thieves as an unjust group of criminals, and vows to take them all down, or all of Japan will suffer the consequences. The Phantom Thieves at first try to find a way to fight against this hacker group, but without any real leads, they have to fall back to a mysterious person that has contacted them, a hacker going by the alias Alibaba. They ask them for a rather odd request to change their own heart, and in turn, they will help with Medjed. And with no options and the clock ticking down, they must agree. But it's not as simple as that. Who is Alibaba? You see, there's an important aspect I haven't talked about yet in terms of palaces. To access someone's palace, you need to know who the target is for one, and then along that, to which the desires have been distorted from to what they have become. The Phantom Thieves then work to find out who this mysterious person is, and through an investigation, we find that it's someone related to someone we know very well, Sojiro, or better known as Boss. Futaba Sakura is under the guardianship of Sojiro, and through what is clearly a troubled person, the relationship has been strained, which I think is a major reason why Sojiro has been more quiet about Futaba. But after we learn about such information, we can try to get closer to Futaba to change her heart, as she requested. Both because I think she clearly needs the help, and otherwise Medjed will attack all of Japan if we don't turn ourselves in, which I think clearly we aren't going to do. Futaba's palace is actually really interesting story-wise. She's dealing with really major trauma from her mother's death that she witnessed with her own eyes, something that she has never been able to forgive herself for, as she believes she was the reason why her mother did what she did. As we continue forward, we really see how deep this trauma has been burrowed, taking over her entire being. But finally reaching the end, we need to open a mental block, much like with Madarame's, and give her the calling card to steal her treasure. And here is where this palace really becomes really good in my eyes. So far, I think you could really say this palace is interesting, but not really dissimilar to the previous palaces. But instead of Futaba being a rather simple antagonist, she instead enters her own palace, something we didn't even know was possible, seeing for herself what her heart truly is. As she continues on, her own shadow confronts her, and within that, she slowly starts to realize what the truth is behind her entire situation. Something she has always known, but really didn't believe in, as it was easier to believe she was at fault than anything else. When she finally reaches the top of her palace and sees what is behind her trauma, it's her own mother, cursing Futaba for everything. This is what Futaba really thinks her mother was like towards her, what she believed, what she was told. Being battered down again and again, she finally stops averting her eyes from the truth she has known for this entire time, and finally understands.
You're the reason she committed suicide. You were just getting in the way of her research. Why did you think it was suicide?
Because of the note.
Exactly. The men in black suits read her suicide note to you. And what was written on it?
All of her complaints about me.
Yes. The shock and the pain led you to avert your eyes. But they kept reading it aloud in front of your relatives. Think hard. Was that suicide note real? Would the mother you loved so much truly have written that? Did she ever say such horrible things to you?
No! She scolded me whenever I had tantrums, but she cared for me.
Then what about the suicide note?
A total lie!
You were used. They forged her suicide note and laid the blame of her death upon you. They trampled all over your young heart. Get mad. Don't forgive those rotten adults!
It's because I couldn't face myself, or Mom's death. Even then, why did they have to yell at me like that? Futaba-chan?
What denies you is an illusion. A curse put upon you by the Heartless. You knew from the very beginning. And yet, you cowered in fear.
Oh, that's right. I knew, but I...
It's all your fault. This time you'll be the one to die.
Will you die as you are told? Who will you obey? Cursed words spat out by a seething illusion? Or the truth within your own soul?
It's your fault. It's all your
I won't let those distorted lies deceive me anymore. And I won't be led astray by others' voices either. I'm going to trust my own eyes and my own heart to distinguish the truth from the lies. There's no way you're my mom! You're just a fake created by those horrid adults! I'll never forgive them! What is that? Huh? Whoa! Oh. Oh. Oh.
contract. I am thou. Thou art I. The forbidden wisdom has been revealed. No mysteries. No illusions shall deceive you any longer.
After defeating her own mother, or more like her palace's version of it, we can finally see what Futaba knows is the real mother she knew, finally able to say goodbye in some way and move forward. Futaba's palace and her entire arc is easily one of my favorite parts of the entire game, and easily the best palace narratively so far. Her being a party member, albeit one that can't be used in battle, is pretty cool to see. It takes a pretty unique take from the previous palaces, and it really isn't spoiled with the interrogation room. Quite the opposite fact, it plays off the interrogation room pretty well. It can be suspenseful in the beginning and really heartfelt in the end, having a good balance of what I think makes a good palace ruler a good palace ruler. Okumura is the real turning point for the group as a whole. At the height of their own popularity after taking down Medjed with the help of Futaba, they look for their next target, and instead of their more usual method of finding someone who they feel is truly worth it, instead a more populist influence is taken hold. This arc is actually rather complex, with how many different angles and story threads either realized here are really starting to take hold. This arc is the only real time the group disagrees on the target, causing a fragmentation with Morgana and the rest of the party. This is where Morgana's climactic character arc happens, and while we have already delved into that in his own Confidants storyline, this is also the important part with Haru, instantly enough realizing her own persona, albeit one that is rather weak. As the group tries to reconcile with Morgana, we already figure out that Okumura does in fact have a palace, and we have a way in. In a way, these circumstances are a wake-up call for both Morgana and the rest of the group. Maybe not to the point we see later on within this own arc, but it's definitely the start of their turnaround. But Okumura is far from a forced target. He is clearly a rather terrible person, forcing workers to work over and over again, almost to the death at times, which can be seen in his palace. His own design is very upfront to how he views his own company and especially his workers. A space station, building towards what he believes is a utopia. Everyone else below him nothing more than robot. Far from humans, but simple mechanical beings that only purpose are to work and work till they can't anymore. Haru has known this for some extent for longer than she would probably care to admit, but as she becomes more a part of the Phantom Thieves, she realizes more and more of what her father truly is now. Not the father she once knew when she was younger, but someone who hasn't cared about the people beneath him or even her for a rather long time. When Haru finally confronts her own father in the metaverse, she is finally forced to see what he has become. Alongside the disgusting behavior of her forced fiance, what her father understands of his own nature and how he really doesn't seem to care about how Haru feels in all this. Nothing more than a puppet to be used under the whims of Okumura. This is finally the last straw, when Haru finally realizes her true power.
Let's have fun. I'll play with you until I get bored. A high school fiance what it's around.
So vulgar. No! Haru's persona won't stand a chance against that. Don't worry. She hadn't awakened to her real power. That's all.
How dare you?
I see you finally made up your mind, my dear fated princess. Freedom for you must stem from betrayal. If you still yearn for it now, then you must not err. Now tell me, who shall you betray?
My heart has been set. You should know.
Yes, that gaze! I can finally display my true strength! I am thou, thou art I! Let us adorn your departure into freedom with a beautiful betrayal!
Jeez!
Farewell, dear father. I am no longer your subservient puppet!
The Okumura arc is the real first step towards the final arc, with more and more of what is seemingly behind the scenes being shown more in the light. Okumura is moving towards the political world. That is his utopia, what he has been building towards. When we finally defeat him, and a rather interesting boss fight to say the least, he is a truly pathetic person who even used what was called the mental shutdowns that have been plaguing Japan. A real first into what was a rather obfuscated lead from our own lack of knowledge. He would send contracts to get competitors and other people in his way for a mental shutdown, but other than that, he knows nothing more. We take his treasure and leave him for his own devices, as his palace slowly collapses around him.
my utopia.
This is the first time as we, the player, finally get to see who this Black Mask Killer sort of is, and that becomes more apparent as we get more and more into the later arcs. This, as well as when the popularity of the Phantom Thieves really starts to take a shift. In a press conference, Okumura is seen confessing to his sins, and right before he talks about the contract killing, Okumura is seen having a mental shutdown, killed on air, with Taru and the rest of the Phantom Thieves watching as they celebrate this victory. As you saw, Okumura was killed in his own palace. That is how you cause a mental shutdown. Of course, the thieves don't know this as of yet, but they failed. This is the real first time we see the thieves in a lot more of a human light, as more of a group than as the individuals as they are. Individualistically, they are very human. Their Confidant storylines show a lot more of a deeper aspect to them and a lot more vulnerabilities. But I think as a group, I think it's harder to see that at times, and I like this arc for what it does with that. Later on, they start to really understand or feel sorrow that they did this. They really start to understand that popularity isn't the driving factor that started them on this course of action. It's their form of justice. It's the hope they give to people. The Phantom Thieves' sole goal is to help people, is to give people hope. It isn't a popularity contest, and that got a little obfuscated. You can definitely see this with Ryuji, for example, I think is the most apparent in this. He can definitely be seen as only caring for the popular opinion. He is adamant against going to Okumura because the people want it. But afterwards, you can see that he's understanding, or a little bit more understanding, that this wasn't the right course of action. Or more yet, they didn't do this for the right reasons. They fell into this trap that they had no idea was coming up behind them because they fell into their own popularity. And that's what I really like about this arc. It makes the group as a whole feel a lot more human than the superhuman elements that they feel like throughout the story. These undefeatable, impenetrable superheroes. And while that isn't really true for them as characters, I think it's a little more true for them as a group. And I definitely like this arc specifically because it made them a lot more human. As well, I like that they disagreed on a target. I think discontent was not really seen a whole lot within this group. I definitely wanted to see more of it. I think that these are a group of teenagers, not really hardened criminals, or really a united bond. They have a bond, but they're not like cohesive. They're still very young and very new to this entire situation they're in. And I think I would have liked to see more of that. But I think what we got here was really good. But overall, I do think Okumura is a rather weak villain. I think he's rather okay. I don't think he's exceptional. I think what makes this arc really good is the stuff that happens around him more than with him. With the different elements finally coming to light with the Black Mask Killer that leads into the next arc, this arc is definitely a very much a really solid stepping point into really what is the climax of this entire story. The arc resides with the flashback aspects of the main story finally collide with the present. Sai's arc is definitely one of the more interesting ones for how many different aspects finally collide with each other that have been building up behind the scenes. Sai is a consistent antagonist throughout the entire game, because of that flashback narrative device I keep hammering back to, and with Makoto being her younger sister. We are continually seeing Sai and how she's been functioning with the entire Phantom Thieves and the mental shutdown cases, to which she assumes are connected. When we finally understand that we need to go after Sai as our only way to save our own skin from the outlashing force of the police, this is another one of those times where the flashback narrative device works in favor of the story instead of hindering it. When Sai pulls out her calling card is a really great way of showing who the next palace ruler is. We see it for ourselves instead of being told from Sai. And the nature of not really knowing if her heart really has changed due to her nature staying the same throughout till this point only adds to that. This is where a lot of the shit goes down and where a lot of the hidden elements and foreshadowing gets revealed for the last arc of the story. I have purposely left a character out of this conversation for a very obvious reason. Akechi. Akechi is a very polarizing character in how he's dealt with, especially in the original. In Sai's Palace though, he's a very important aspect to how this entire arc works, when we start to realize and how he confronts us for what we really are. Akechi is far from the perfect detective though that he can be shaped to be, but we will get to that. Sai's Palace though is actually rather straightforward. It's a casino shaped from a court building. Justice to her, and the entire justice system for a matter of fact, is a gambling system, a casino, one that she can break in her own favor to continue winning. She isn't focused on what justice really is to her anymore. Instead, it's a way forward in her own career, really losing sight of what she once had. And this is where Makoto comes in and has some really interesting and emotional connections in this arc that I really did like to see from her. Sai, being her older sister, does bring a rather emotional and deep aspect for Makoto to consider, and Makoto really wants Sai to fight her away again, as Makoto has with the Phantom Thieves. And these elements have been building up behind the scenes with Makoto and her sister interacting with each other. And Makoto has known for a while that Sai has changed in some way, especially after the death of their father. Sai had to work for the both of them, being forced into working harder and harder for what she believes fighting in an unjust system. She is a woman and she feels like she has to continually prove herself again and again to give what she thinks she is deserved. And the death of all that, losing her own way and becoming what all of this is. But as we see more and more of the elements of how Sai really thinks of the justice system, rigged more and more in her own favor, we are finally able to beat her at her own game and reach to her treasure. As we try to steal her heart though, Futaba meets hundreds of enemies coming in and appearing out of nowhere. Without any real plan or really what is happening, we have to devise a plan to get out with the treasure in tow. Joker allows himself to be the bait for everyone else to escape. And this is really what we saw in the beginning come into light, what that truly was. In the past reaches the present, and all the elements that have been building up are finally put into the spotlight. We are caught, and without knowing if Sai really had to change her heart or not, we slowly come back to our senses in the interrogation room. We need to give Sai the phone that was on the table, and she agrees, for some reason. I think Sai finally starts to believe in Joker, and works with him. I think she finally starts to understand who is behind all this. I think she is known for a rather long time, and I really like this element of her slowly changing her heart and finding her own justice again throughout this entire interrogation scene. I think for one reason really in particular is that it links back to Mishima, and that someone can change their own heart and their own justice and their own values without our actions being involved in the metaverse. This is finally when we revealed that Akechi is the Black Masked Killer, the mysterious individual that has been on the radar of the Phantom Thieves since Madarame's palace, but we've really not got any leads on them for who they were, till Akechi himself slips up and everything comes into motion.
We have breaking news. The young man being held in custody has committed suicide. The police have confirmed his death, although details have not been released. To repeat, the suspect has committed suicide while in
custody. This station will continue to report any further updates as they arrive.
It may be difficult to uncover his methods now. Perhaps that's why he decided to take this course of action.
It can't be.
You're shitting me. We got him.
This entire twist is definitely one of my more favorite parts of the game. My first time playing, I never really saw it coming. More so, I wasn't really looking back then either, but even now I think it still works well enough. It's finally in this game where we see a climactic aspect that has been building up for what seemed like ages blow up. We had a plan all along, and that plan is rather weird. After Akechi pulls up on us on the school festival and tells us that he knows we are the Phantom Thieves, we work towards understanding what Akechi is and what he's really up to. We had an inkling that this man wasn't who we thought he was, and the infamous scene of pancakes is actually relevant to this story, to basically everyone's surprise at that time. See, there's an important aspect of Morgana I haven't brought up yet. Morgana is just a normal cat to everyone, but to the people who've entered the metaverse. Then they can understand Morgana. You see, Morgana was the only person talking about pancakes far in the past during a school trip, and Akechi comes in and asks about pancakes during their conversation, which to the shock of An, Ryuji, and Joker at that time, he heard. That was the real stepping stone towards what was an inkling towards Akechi's real identity. We worked with Akechi and tricked him behind the scenes to figure out what he was really doing and who he really was, and learning his true motive while we were working towards Sai's palace. But I think before I really talk about Akechi here, I do want to say this plan is kinda wild. I liked it for what it is. I think it's a rather cool element, and to see it all work was definitely cool to see. But I think when we actually start to think about it, it really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It definitely feels like it was built upon a rather specific amount of circumstances happening, and without any of them working, Joker would have been basically killed. Now, I do think a story can make a disbelievable element of the story for a specific story beat. After all, we are definitely in a fantasy-esque setting. It's a fictional world. I wouldn't say that this beat really pulled me away from the story in any meaningful way, but it's definitely a stretch to believe when you start to think about the details in play. But overall, this palace was really, really good. Sai was a really good, consistent antagonist. I like the elements with Makoto interacting with that. I think Akechi was really well done here. He has more of an allure, but if we learn more and more about him later on in this arc, it becomes really cool. And this is where a lot of that foreshadowing and build up finally becomes into the light, and a lot of stuff starts really rolling. I just really like this arc. I think it's definitely one of the best in the stories, and unfortunately, it doesn't continue. Akechi is personally one of my favorite characters. He is an emotionally damaged person that is being manipulated and used by Shido, the main orchestrator behind all the events surrounding the mental shutdowns that have been plaguing Japan. Joker and Akechi form a rather odd bond, not one of really friendship but rivalry in reaching past their own limits. Boyle adds more to this relationship by giving him his own social link, instead of the original, where all the confidants were leaked directly to the main story. Here we get some more in-depth aspects of the facade that Akechi holds up, the mask that is in front of the crazed, emotionally damaged person. I honestly see him as a counter to Joker's personality in a way. Instead of fighting for selfless reasons, to cure the world of injustice and lift people up, Akechi is drawn only for selfish reasons, to gain power to enact revenge on his father that left him and his mother very early in his life. I kinda love that different nature we see from Akechi, the mask he holds and his actual person. I know some people might dislike this element in one way or another, and I'm not here to really debate that. You can dislike him in whichever way you want, but to me, and especially in Royal, it felt like an actual twist in who this person was. The original game is a different story in terms of this, and it really doesn't hold strength compared to how his character was dealt in Royal. I know I haven't delved into any specific Confidant rank yet, but Akechi's rank A Confidant, in my opinion, is one of the best Confidant ranks in the entire game. Through his own confidence, we see that Akechi is very competitive towards Joker, continue to edge over each other to reach past their own limits. This culminates in a battle in Mementos between you and Akechi. This is our real first hint to Akechi's full personality and attitudes towards Joker. As I've said, it's not a bond of friendship between these characters. Akechi despises Joker with almost all his being, but there's a connection of rivalry too, once again, pushing each other past their own limits. They were both born from rather similar circumstances and events, but bridged off to different sides. Akechi really is not the greatest character written ever, I would never say that, but what they do in Royal was honestly way better to me than in the original game. Of course, I would never excuse the actions of Akechi, but I think they made him a more understandable and sympathetic character than they did in the original game. And that leads us into the Shido arc. Shido is just honestly a rather big disappointment to me. The matter is they built him up for almost the entire game, and it doesn't really land on much of anything I thought it would. Not in the good way either. The person that caused you to be in the specific circumstance you're in, to me, it just feels like it came across as a build-up that it just means to get to the main climactic part of the story, instead of himself being a thought-provoking character. Someone who didn't care about Akechi at all, and even used him to his own ends and was planning to kill him after after all was said and done. They make him a truly despicable person. I don't think they really give him anything to build off on that in his own story. The whole build-up with Sai's palace and the great work that arc did to lead up to Shido and Akechi just really never pays off as I thought it would. It comes across as rather box standard palace ruler, someone who's in an incredibly powerful place of power and uses it to their own means and desire. There are some interesting aspects with cognitive science, I guess, and how that relates to Wakaba and Futaba, but that's really the only thing I can remember at this point. What I found was memorable from this entire palace was with Akechi, easily the best part of the entire story arc. And you know why Akechi was great? Because of that build-up he had and how it paid off in a much more successful and satisfying way, even in the original game, and Boyo only made that better. I really just don't have a lot to say on Shido, because that's how I felt it was played out as well. Something that really wasn't meant to be an actual story arc, and Shido not being an actual antagonist themselves, that was playing off as a build-up and story threads placed along the way, instead as a way to get to the real final arc of the story. And to me, that is just incredibly disappointing. After defeating Shido is when the story does the twist that almost awaits all Persona games, where all the themes and underlying foreshadowing culminate into what the actual final arc is. To give a bit of context, when Shido has his heart changed, the public really doesn't seem to care or even acknowledge that these events transpired. Mementos seems to be the most likely answer to what these events are, as Mementos is the quote-unquote palace of the general public, almost the heart of humanity. After investigating and reaching the lowest limits of Mementos, what is found is not all too pleasant. The public, or better, the shadows of everyone, are willingly in creepy jail cells. Even the shadows of all the previous palace rulers that you forced to change your heart on. Even grateful, showing an almost similar feeling towards the entire general public, that their desires were stolen and now they have to think for themselves. Finally, reaching the bottom of Mementos, we can see that the treasure of mankind, the Holy Grail, a god of humanity. Persona has always dealt with gods linked directly to humanity and the collective unconscious. Here, the desire for life to be easy and being told what to do and not think has given rise to a powerful being, declaring itself a god of control. Yaldabaoth, the creator and mastermind of Mementos, and the events leading towards this conclusion. He wanted to see which side of humanity would rise and which desire would control humanity, the desire for freedom or control, rebellion versus the status quo. This finale to me is pretty strong. It works off the multiple different elements built up throughout the entire game. The fact that Igor, the master of the Velvet Room who guides you along your path, is much more antagonistic and even calls your journey a rehabilitation. His VA as well was changed to associate with this change. And in truth, it's because Yaldabaoth imprisoned the real Igor and played the role himself to force his way, winning the deal set between him and the real Igor. It's a twist that I personally never expected and still works so well after multiple playthroughs, and especially if you played the previous games before. When you first fight against the God of Control, you are powerless against the might of the general public, and even lose, as he combines the false reality of Mementos with the true reality, forming a culmination of the general public's collective unconscious into its own warped reality. It's only through your own strengths of heart and desire for rebellion that you can bring together all your comrades that have lost their will and forge ahead to change the fate of humanity, to complete the fool's journey to the world. What makes this finale so powerful isn't its own narrative strengths, it's how its true culmination of the themes that Persona 5 represents. The 7 deadly sins are front and center in this game. Each palace ruler represents a deadly sin, from greed to sloth, the sin that gave power to the god of control. We can take the fight to the true form of Yaldabaoth, showing to the world that we can forge a new path from our own will. We shouldn't have our life set, we can change the dominoes as we wish and forge ahead towards a path we truly believe in. Humans are more powerful than we can believe. We can force change in our own lives if we truly want to. Life is unfair and will always have pushback towards a better change for us. We have the power to stand back up and continue forward. The greatest obstacles can't stop the will for a better life. You can and should fight against the injustice of society, of your own life. Every story arc, confidant, and party member shows this in action. Through our own abilities, we can stand back up and continue towards a better future. At the end of it all, the entire population of Japan fights back against Yaldabaoth. Finally breaking our chains of control with a single bang, breaking the chains that bind us.
So you have failed to harness the power. No matter how many prayers of those foolish masses come together.
What the?
Be gone.
Preposterous! You dare honor people's wishes!
To say that I love this ending is kind of putting it lightly. The themes that combine towards moving towards a better tomorrow and how that culminated in almost every aspect of the game put forth are really awesome. Well, yes, I did say I like this arc, and I do for what it does thematically for the game's narrative and how it portrays them. However, it has a major problem. And the other Persona games as well have had this problem. It's with the build-up. Now, I'm not saying there isn't any build-up at all throughout the entire game. Yes, if you look at Mementos and how that was portrayed early on in the game as the so-called Palace of the General Public, and if you have played the previous games before, Ego could have been a real hint. But with almost nothing really leading you towards the actual conclusion till you're basically already there. In some reality, I guess you could have figured out something with that. But that really isn't any actual build-up besides a thematic build-up, which is important, but not everything a build-up is for a finale. It's almost the complete opposite with Shido, in fact. Shido had a ton of actual build-up throughout the entire game, and felt personal, even if the landing and execution of that fell flat for me in the end, because of what they were trying to do with the setup of the God of Control. While the God of Control was, in my opinion, executed pretty damn good with what it was given in a very short amount of time compared to Shido. I would have loved to see so much more actual build-up for this finale, because I really did like it thematically, and what it portrays for the game's narrative as a whole. The God of Control is a realization of what the real problems with injustice and what the Phantom Thieves have been fighting against. It isn't a singular person who is at fault. They are a symptom more than anything else that spreads such injustice. It's a societal issue with how society deals with these problems with either a lacking amount of care or politeness towards these real problems, rather living in bliss than helping with these issues that need fixing. It's a really realistic theme and portrayal of real issues we deal with in all of society at the moment, but it really isn't what it should have been with how lackluster the build-up was, and it leaves me a bit conflicted, but ultimately happy with how it all turned out. It's not all done perfectly, but the heart of the game is in the right place, and to me, that is what matters most. Games would never be perfect, but what makes a great game is the heart and soul behind what is being told. Persona 5 is a representation of humanity as a whole, a flawed but hopefully heart-filled piece. Now, this is where the original game would end, letting the world right its own wrongs and leaving the Phantom Thieves bygone as a sign of hope for humanity. Being sent to jail in the hope of finally getting Shido convicted, and with the help of your friends and the people you helped along the way, you can be freed from your charges. Months pass by and you leave back home with your friends and Toll on one of the last final trips to the Phantom Thieves in all but name. But in Royal, this is far from over. Wow. Wow. It took me a long while to finally play Royal, and only after the PC release was I able to get it together and experience what this version has to offer. And to say this added element is the best part of the entire game would honestly be putting it lightly. There is a lot to delve into, and elements I purposely left out in case you noted. Before we get right into the main meat of the third semester, let's roll it back to major characters that we should familiarize ourselves with and learn a bit before it all happens. After the events of the entire Kamashido arc, the school decides to hire a therapist to help the students affected by the trauma of such an ordeal. Mariki is available around midway through the game, a bit before that and leaves a bit before the final arc happened. Mariki has his confidant that is a bit interesting compared to other confidants and easily is one of the best ones. You don't have a normal therapist-patient relationship, instead you help him work on his thesis about something incredibly similar to what we've been doing, saving someone from trauma and painful experiences by changing their own cognition. It's a very interesting thesis indeed. Most of the confidant deals with exploring different avenues for Mariki's thesis, him spitballing ideas out and Joker listening in and giving advice. Mariki believes that pain shouldn't exist and humans don't have to suffer with the emotional pain we suffer from the cause of some inner or outside circumstances. These reasons and how personal they are for him are what make him such a sympathetic and relatable character. Compared to the other confidants, it's one of the more unique ones for just how incredibly well done it is. For one, with the subject matter it deals with and how it deals with it itself. Mariki himself is an incredibly vulnerable person dealing with the trauma of a break-in that happened a few years ago, and his girlfriend now suffers some extreme PTSD. Mariki hasn't been able to forgive himself for the situation, and this is the central reasoning for why he's working on cognitive science and working towards changing his own cognition to help the people who have been suffering. Overall, I really enjoy this confidant. It has such great emotional weight behind it with such a strong core character, great pacing, and just great writing overall. As you probably figured out, Mariki is a vital character to the third semester and a core element of what makes it a fantastic part of the game. Lastly, but certainly not least, is Kusumi. Kusumi is a rare 5 rank confidant that opens up around the same time as Mariki. Kusumi is a gymnast who is incredibly talented and working to become one of the top gymnasts in the world. What I like about Mariki applies very well to Kusumi. She gives a facade of being a very outgoing and chill person, but as we get to know her, she's going through a slump mentally, as she says, and is forced to take a break due to lackluster performance. Her coach gives us a prompt of finding out who she is. Through this relationship, she is one of the few people who awakens to her own persona but declines to join the Phantom Thieves. Her reasons aside, it's a very interesting move to have a character both learn about your own experiences and awaken to her persona but decline to join. What makes it different as well is that she's a 5 rank confidant compared to the normal 10 rank. It gives us a weird feeling of not being completely the truth of the entire situation, but as you continue spending time with Kusumi, you learn more about her as a person, but there is more going beneath her that she isn't speaking or letting us know about. We learn from a conversation that her younger sister, Sumeri, passed away in a car accident recently. As you can probably surmise, it had an incredibly difficult impact on Kusumi and has been a tough subject for her. The reason why no one brings up around her, and why she knows Dr. Mariki as she has a claim to. She's been going to therapy to deal with the trauma of her sister's unfortunate passing. Kusumi is a deeply troubled character, more than she lets on, and more is going beneath the surface that we don't get to see till the third semester. Let me bring us all the way back to right after we defeated Yaldabaoth, and Sei asks us to be sent to prison as a way to increase the odds of Shido's conviction. Instead of the normal route where you go to prison, a familiar face appears, one that you thought died in Shido's palace. Akechi comes out of the woodwork and decides that he will take your place and accept punishment for the crimes he admitted in an attempt to give Shido his just punishment. It's an incredibly shocking event, but only appears if you gain a great level of trust with Akechi. This somewhat alludes to maybe he learned a thing or two from you, but you take it. Understanding this is what Akechi wants to do to redeem himself for the crimes he committed and finally live life on his own terms. Life seemingly returns to normal, all till the beginning of the new year. The third semester is a whole new arc interjected at the end of the original game's ending, only opening up if you achieve specific requirements circling the confidant ranks of Mariki, Kusumi, and Akechi. Let's just jump right into the fucking meat of this. Mariki is the new palace ruler for this arc, but instead of being a quote-unquote villain in plate terms, he is far from a bad person. Actually, the complete opposite. He is doing this for the perceived good of everyone. As been touched upon, Mariki has been working on the same science that Shido used to manipulate and control his country. Mariki instead uses his own power to change the cognition of everyone. Much like the god of control as well, he fused mementos and reality into one, forming the reality of conscious and the general public.
Now I have to say this, Marquis is far and above one of the most well-written Persona 5 antagonists, not just in the game alone, which he fucking sweeps in, but almost in the entire series. None feel the same or hit as hard as Marquis did within his reasons and motivations for doing what he has done. Instead of being controlled by his own disgusted desires, he works for what he believes is the good of everyone, by forcing a change of heart to give them a better life, an easier life. And right there is what makes the entire third semester fucking incredible. The way he gives people a better life is by removing the emotional pain, and by that removing the source of that pain, giving people what they desire, or giving them something that is quote unquote good for them. More on that later. Ranging from giving people their dreams come true, removing traumatic periods of a person's life, or even reviving dead loved ones. Do you remember when I said Kasumi is leaving something untold? Where this is where it culminates to and shows gracefully Muraki's viewpoint and what he believes is right. Kasumi isn't the person we think she is. When she told us that her sister died in a car accident, Sumeri.
Today was brutal, huh? Oh. Feeling okay? It's not that. Why am I doing so bad? I keep messing up my routine. Your growth spurts just changed your eye level. You'll get used to it. Look, you're as tall as I am now. We practice the same amount. But you are the one who always gets first place. I can't catch up to you, Kasumi. You know why? Because it's my right as the elder sister. We're in the same grade, though. Oh, don't be so down. We'll reach the top of the world together. That's our dream, right? You don't get it. Huh? You'll never understand how I feel. What? Kasumi, if I were like you, things would be so much better. Hey, wait up! Kasumi's the one that people want. Look where you're going! The light's red! Hey! The talented one who can reach the top of the world. Sumire, stop! Listen to me! Sumire! What? Kasumi.
When we confront Mariki in his palace, he tells us that Kasumi isn't Kasumi. Instead of confronting the death of her sister, she instead takes over the personality of her sister, Kasumi. When Sumeri went to Mariki for therapy, she had deep insecurities about her sister that died, saving her own life. Mariki tried to help her through this traumatic event, and during this time he had already awakened to his own persona, the ability to change reality. During this event, we can see the extent of his abilities and the change for Sumeri. Mariki gives in to her wish for Sumeri to become someone else, someone that didn't kill her sister, someone that doesn't feel the way she feels, someone different. After changing her into a Kasumi has such an impact on her mental well-being, Mariki truly only cares for the happiness of people. He went through the pain no one should have to go through, and he wants everyone to not have to go through hardships. But in doing so, doesn't he remove what makes people people? Sumeri was changed to a completely different person in the name of her own happiness, but is that the right option? Of course, it's not a simple answer, but we already know that the fighting for a better future is what makes us human and what makes us us. The hardships, even if they may hurt deeply, are what makes us who we are. The Phantom Thieves are the epitome of this idea. People who have dealt with incredible hardships and trauma, and use that to grow as people and use the power they have to fight for other people who are in the same situation as them. Fighting for the injustice of society to give hope to people in need, instead of Mariki changing the people to give them happiness. Mariki is far from a bad person. He's an incredibly flawed human being given the power to change reality for what he perceives as the betterment of humanity. And that is the core of what makes him one of the best characters in Persona. He's a character that isn't much different than the God of Control who used his power to take control of humanity. But Marquis does it for much more benevolent reasons. But those means don't matter if they are for the good or just for control. Losing control of your own destiny and your fate is against the ideals of what makes us in the first place. Giving into the whims of Marquis, a god in his own making, is no different than when society gave into the whims of Yaldabaoth. He never wants to fight the Phantom Thieves. He believes in their goal and believes he can actually achieve it, even giving them the offer to let things go and give in to his own reality, to finally let their dreams become reality. It's a tempting offer for sure, but it's just one that we cannot accept. The only way to end this is put an end to Marquis' rule, to fight the man who wants nothing more than happiness. But that happiness can be seen as nothing more than a deeply hurted person projecting his fears onto everyone else. He feels that the feelings he has, once he faces the emotion he's been holding back, he himself wouldn't be able to handle them. But even when we try to convince each other of what we believe is the right choice, no one changes their stand. We have to fight even if we don't want to. His boss fight is a really good example of what I've said. In his boss fight, he tries to convince the group to let go and give in to his reality. This is when he finally realizes that he's been running away from all his emotions, but he just can't give up. He only asks that they end. Finally, win and put an end to what he has been creating.
Feel the regrets he would have had if he just gave up on the one thing he truly believes in.
Two people, Joker and Marquis, throwing against each other. Just them, no powers, nothing. Just two fists throwing their frustration at each other. The wants and dreams of each of them clashing with each other.
The disappearance of my palace, of the entire metaverse, is drawing near. Seems like neither of us can summon our personas anymore. Let's begin. I gave up everything! Everything! So why? Why? Why, Rumi? A reality where no one suffers. I'm done. I get it now. All thanks to you. Come on. I said I'm done. Please, let go of my hand. Your eyes are as bright and honest as ever. You keep your head up no matter what. I must have always been afraid. afraid you and I wouldn't wish for the same reality. So bright.
I would be lying if the scene didn't hit me. I do understand how this all feels, and that is what makes this arc all the more powerful. Mariki is someone I think we can all relate to in some way. Our dreams, our hardships, our personality, everything that we are is what makes us us, and not on the whims of someone else's insecurities. It's a shocking level of quality difference between the third semester and the rest of the game. It makes some of the early aspects feel way more hollow comparatively. I want to see more what they can do with this level of quality, these type of emotionally deep and thought-provoking characters. The third semester is simply the best part of the entire game, and one of the best parts of the entire Persona franchise. Persona 5 is an incredibly flawed game. With so many flaws to its name, I still can't do anything but still love it. Its heart is in the right place, and what it does within its story is there. And to me, that is what matters the most in any type of game. Not every aspect is going to be as perfectly crafted as the third semester was, but I don't think it never tries to change what it is or tell something otherwise. It's not my favorite in the franchise. Persona 3 takes that cake, but it holds a different place. It has gotten to be through some tough times and has allowed me to experience themes and characters that I really enjoy and find almost compelling to interact with. I will always come back with some major fondness for the memories I was able to experience playing this game. Nothing has been able to reach the same sort of place that this game has for me. That doesn't stop me from acknowledging that this game has some real major problems, especially in the gameplay. But that's what we are supposed to do, critique what we love, but also still praising it. I want Persona to become better and better, and I truly think they can do it. They have the ability to create some of the best stories ever. They just have to reach for it. But no matter what, Persona 5 is truly a brilliant game. One that's incredibly hard to say goodbye to, but like all things, we have to, as the contract has finally been fulfilled and life returns to normal. At least we can say our final goodbyes to our friends and comrades, as this chapter has reached its final conclusion.